That's what we're dealing with, ladies and gentlemen. A Secretary of State that has had sex in giant vats of feces.
Alex Jones is an American radio show and podcast host who is known for his constant exploration of wild conspiracy theories, as well as his emotional anti-leftist outbursts.
Murder the Christians. Destroy everything.
His brand has become much more akin to that of a meme or an entertaining nut job as opposed to just a fringe news source in recent years. Nonetheless, Apple, Spotify, Facebook, and YouTube have all decided within the span of 24 hours to ban him and much of his content from their platforms.
But still stumbling forward, more blood. As he falls down, they go, our God must be lifted back up.
They all cited different but similar reasons for banning him. It mostly comes down to Alex Jones engages in hate speech and therefore he should be banned. Free speech advocates see this as the start of a slippery slope. Since the term hate speech doesn't mean anything concrete, the logic goes that the same can be used later to deplatform actual conservatives as the Overton window shrinks.
More blood.
In addition to that, the fact that all of these platforms did this at the same time, it gives credence to this idea that these companies colluded or are being pushed by left-wing media or some left-wing political groups to deplatform Jones.
Sell the baby parts, arrest the reporters that expose for keeping babies alive, eat the hospitals with their bodies, have the Pepsi taste testing systems be based on fetal tissue, all demonic systems, genetically engineer all the crops, overthrow creation, more blood.
With the massive influence that these social media platforms have, it's leading many people on the right to ask if the government should step in and enforce free speech on these private companies.
That's Hillary.
What they fail to realize, however, is that that doesn't make any fucking sense. So I'm asked what I think about the Alex Jones situation, and when I am asked, I assume that people sort of already understand my moral principles on the matters of things like free speech and whatnot, so I assume they're just wondering what my personal take on the situation is. If you watch my first video on punching Nazis, then you have an idea of where I lie morally with this, and so when someone asked me what my opinion was on the Alex Jones situation, I said that while I'm not a fan of Alex Jones, I do think this is troubling. I think it's setting a dangerous precedent when major social media companies are banning people with vague terms like hate speech and bullying.
I start thinking about Bill Gates up there with that little chicken neck, hopping her now, a little murdering eugenicist. You know how he walks like a demonic elf. Hey, Bill Gates.
I said I don't think that this is the end, because while now they may just be banning sort of these brash clowns that, you know, they might have popular support for, the same vague justification can be used to silence conservatives and other people with which the powerful media heads disagree. I figured I didn't need to say it, but I did mention that while I disagree with the decision, I think that these media companies should be allowed to host and not host whoever they want. I think most people understand my sort of extremist libertarian view on freedom of speech, but the funny thing about it was the pushback that I got was more from people on the right, conservative groups. There's been this sort of blossoming idea on the right that these companies should be prevented from discriminating against conservative content for one reason or another. In other words, these companies should be forced to host all content, regardless of right-wing political commentators. Dennis Prager and Mike Cernovich, maybe others, are or were suing some of these platforms for this very type of discrimination. There are a number of different arguments that I've seen for this line of thinking. So before I delve into the troubling nature of the ban itself, I want to look critically at the thinking behind this ludicrous idea on the neo-right. I do just want to say that this is going to be mostly just me rambling about my understanding and the philosophy in my mind with regard to this issue and freedom of speech. In order to keep people watching, I'm going to be sprinkling just little clips of Alex Jones throughout, because, you know, I may as well use someone else's content if I can't personally be interesting or entertaining.
So we're like a thought or a dream that's a wisp in some computer program, some God's mind, whatever. They're proving it all. It's all coming out.
The basic argument goes like this. 1. Google, who owns YouTube, controls a wildly disproportionate amount of web traffic and content. 2. They are obviously discriminating against conservatives, even if they don't admit it. 3. Therefore, companies with this much power have something akin to a monopoly, and the government needs to watch over them to make sure that they don't discriminate against people with which they disagree. This is obviously an oversimplification, but that's sort of where the bulk of the arguments come from. I tend to agree with the two premises being these media companies, these social media companies, particularly Google, Facebook kind of, and Twitter, control widely disproportionate amount and have a lot of power when it comes to that. 2, they do discriminate against conservatives to a very large degree, some more than others, obviously. But having a lot of power and being a monopoly are two very different things. So let's just get into sort of the most simple talking points when it comes to this sort of argument. I saw a meme on Facebook the other day, and by the way, life is memes now, so we just have to learn to navigate the world through the lens of memes. It sucks in a lot of ways because meme culture oversimplifies arguments, but we have to learn to navigate it because it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So it's best that we just embrace meme culture and try to find ways to make nuanced arguments with memes because, again, it's not going anywhere, folks. Anyway.
And to try to have an actual debate about where humanity goes and cut off the pedophiles and psychic vampires that are in control of this AI system.
The meme implied that libertarians and libertarian-leaning conservatives, they say, don't tread on me when it comes to the government, but they're all too happy to have corporate overlords, stomp all over them. I understand the sentiment. Liberals try to equate the government and corporations all the time as if they're just the same thing. And I can also understand that conservatives are very frustrated when they're trying to, spread their own message through social media and they keep getting shut down every which way. I get both of those things. I think conservatives are too upset about corporate censorship to realize the implications behind the arguments that they're making. First, it's important to recognize the difference between a corporation and a government. In the modern day, a corporation is a type of firm that is a whole bunch of private people coming together for a common goal. Typically, this is a monetary goal. Sometimes it's a charitable cause. A government, on the other hand, is a group that holds a monopoly of force in a given geographic area. To expand upon that a little, you have to understand private citizens are not allowed to use physical force against one another except in self-defense. The government, on the other hand, is allowed to use physical force on other people or property, or they can grant that right to other people. Of course, the level to which a government can do those types of things depends on the type of government and to some degree the level of corruption. For instance, in a dictatorship like North Korea, to use the most extreme example, the leader of North Korea can kill anyone he wants or take any property that he wants.
Destroy the child. Corrupt them all.
This is their plan, people. These are demons.
Because the dictator is only accountable to himself. On the other hand, a republic like the United States, theoretically, the government is restricted by the Constitution, and it is structured in a way so that the people have some control over telling the government what they can and can't do with their power of using physical force. The only thing that is the same about these two things that makes them a government is that is the body, the government is the body that is the only one allowed to use physical force outside of self-defense in that particular geographic region. Okay, so back to corporations. In order for a corporation to make a profit, it has to provide something for consumers, a product or a service that people are willing to pay for, and that's the only way, outside of if they have a deal with government, that they can, because they can't use physical force. They can't take anything without it being voluntarily given to them. So the more a corporation makes consumers happy, the more money the corporation will make. If a company is not making its potential customers happy enough, a competitor will come in and inevitably sort of take it over in the marketplace, take over their market share by providing the same service for a better price or in a way that makes the consumer more satisfied. With corporations, there are essentially always competitors or potential competitors, which is very important, making it so that companies can't do anything too corrupt or stupid without risking losing a critical mass of their customers. Government, on the other hand, doesn't have that same fail-safe, that same moral hazard in place. If a government messes up, there's no competing government that can take the customers away from this government. What I mean by that is, if a government creates some sort of program that has devastating unintended consequences or starts a war based on illegitimate fears, people cannot just stop paying their government because taxes are taken from them whether they want them taken or not.
Repent now, repent now. I know your mustache is cool. You got little gold-framed glasses. You scare me so bad.
In democratic systems, like in the United States, one can argue that, well, yeah, you can't just go to another person, but the people can vote, and if, one government's messing up too much, we can just vote a whole new slew of representatives in to represent our interests even more, which is a good reason why it's better than a dictatorship. But the problem is it still puts the people who take your money from you in the hands of the majority, not in your own hands. For instance, with a corporation, you're giving the money. You're choosing who you give money to based on your own sort of set of standards or morals or whatever. Whereas the government, it's being taken from you and you don't have a choice. If the majority's position is different than yours, then you're at the whim of that majority. Not only that, but most government officials in the United States are unelected bureaucrats, people who are there from often throughout different administrations, etc.
Nothing against mustaches, just all these cops are little homoerotic gang of mustaches.
Anyway, so when I say I don't want government restricting freedom of speech, I mean I don't want the monopoly on force, the one that I have to obey, to make the decision of what I can and cannot say. Again, because I do not have a choice of whether or not to follow these rules, regardless of how or if I vote. So how is that really different from massive corporations? There are two major differences. The first and most obvious one is that consumers can choose not to give patronage to corporations with practices with which they disagree or are not satisfied with. If you disagree with YouTube's anti-conservative bias, you can cancel your YouTube Red subscription if you have one, or stop watching videos on YouTube because that makes them money through advertisements. If enough people start doing this, then there'll be incentive for a competitor to form, a competitor to YouTube that's either more free or more conservative, or it will incentivize YouTube to stop banning people based on their political agenda. The second reason is that private companies also have free speech. Free speech means that private individuals have the right to say or not say whatever they want without fear of persecution. If someone forms a corporation with their own money and becomes successful, they do not automatically forfeit their right to freedom of speech. If a government forces a company to host content that they otherwise would not host, they are making that company use their own resources to say something that they disagree with for fear of persecution. This is an obvious violation of freedom of speech. Do we forfeit our right to free speech as soon as we form a business? Of course not.
You should understand this is all about wearing mustaches and acting tough. I mean, it's literally a big joke. It's like a 5-year-old dressing up in an army outfit. These are children.
This story is somewhat akin to that gay cake situation. For the most part, conservatives are quick to point out that, of course a baker should not be forced to make a cake for a gay wedding if he doesn't agree with it. It's his, business. It's his money. He created the business. Maybe we don't agree with that, but of course he shouldn't be forced to make this cake for one reason or another. But they don't see the same thing when it's like, well, of course you shouldn't be forced to host content, bake the cake, host the content. Dennis Prager and Mike Cernovich are making slightly more nuanced arguments, but that's where it basically comes down to. Dennis Prager was sort of saying that these companies are basically monopolies, and therefore there should be some sort of antitrust situation or some such bullshit. While I understand this sentiment, it doesn't hold up because there's nothing preventing a competitor to YouTube or Facebook or Twitter should enough people become disenfranchised. There have been many dominant social media platforms before Facebook and Twitter, and there will be some after it. There's even some competitors now, some very small competitors to YouTube and Twitter and whatnot. Cernovich, I believe, is trying to make sort of the argument that that YouTube or Facebook or Twitter won't. There's sort of this implicit agreement between the company and the consumer that they won't discriminate based on politics, and they're breaking sort of that trust that we have. I sort of understand that argument even more, but I'm not a fan of this idea of an implicit contract, like something you're just... If these companies advertise their services as being politically neutral, or they have it in their user agreement, then there's certainly a case to be made for fraud, but there's still no reason to have the government step in and tell them what they can and can't, host on their own platform.
I'm a pioneer. I'm an explorer. I'm a human, and I'm coming.
I didn't really think I'd have to explain this to conservatives, but obviously I did. I'm pretty young, so for most of my politically aware life, conservatives have been on the side of freedom of speech. But historically, that has not always or even often been the case. It seems like free speech tends to be defended by those who are not in power. Right now, we're in a really weird time because conservatives have political power at the moment, but they don't really have cultural power. I mean, they definitely have some, but not as much as the left does. So as a result, they tend to be pushing towards freedom of speech on platforms, freedom of speech under corporations and sort of in the culture. But they're trying to restrict freedom of speech, or some are trying to restrict freedom of speech, make laws and things, trying to turn Facebook into a public utility. By that I mean they want people to be able to say anything they want on social media without fear of persecution or banishment, but they don't want these media company heads to have the same freedom of speech. And I don't want to put all conservatives in that boat. I think it is a minority of conservatives, but you have to be able to stick by your principles. For instance, the new right, Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, people like this, they actually kind of understand the principles behind it. So while they may be frustrated with the anti-conservative bias on these platforms, they're not for having the government step in any way, because I think they are also aware that they realize that any power given to a government that they like will still be there when inevitably a government they don't like is elected. Back when liberals had political power not too long ago, conservatives never wanted the government to restrict freedom of speech. Meanwhile, the IRS was putting extra scrutiny on conservative groups, conservative nonprofits. There was a long time before that when religious conservatives sort of had a lot of the power in the country, and liberals actually wanted to be free to say culturally insensitive things, which is crazy to think about now. The truth is, freedom of speech is always under attack by those in power, and that doesn't matter if they're on the left or on the right, and it's always being defended by the disenfranchised minority, whoever that may be at the time, the ideological minority. So that's why I believe that these companies should be much more hesitant to ban political voices from their platform, but that it is much more dangerous to say that they should be forced to provide a platform for people.
I'm animated. I'm alive. My heart's big. It's got hot blood going through it fast.
This video is probably already going long, but to touch on the meat of the Alex Jones situation in particular, banning him is a bad idea. Not only is the Streisand effect going to make people more interested in Alex Jones and in InfoWars in general, but the fact that they all these firms banned him within the same stretch of 24 hours for similarly vague reasons is going to like I said, lend credence to the idea that it's a conspiracy against Jones himself, which is, of course, his bread and butter. In addition to that, I'm not sure there wasn't a coordinated effort. It seems almost self-evident that it was coordinated to some degree. And since the ban, some minor politicians have come out saying that more, wrong speak should be banned, people with bad opinions should be banned. There's even been many major news articles out about how Twitter was wrong not to ban Alex Jones, and they're really going into Twitter being one of the only major companies that didn't ban him. And finally, I do believe that this is just the start of a conservative purge. I read that since this happened, since the Alex Jones situation, Gavin McInnes and the Proud Boys have been banned from Twitter and YouTube, I think. There's a whole lot of different bannings going on, so it just seems to me that it's going to be a problem. I know this video was targeted more at militant conservatives than anyone else, but if we don't check these guys, these conservatives, as the pendulum is swinging widely to the right, they're going to become the same kind of problem the leftists are now. Well, that's going to do it for me today, folks. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and maybe subscribe. If you didn't like the video, then instead you can just like it and subscribe to the channel. Maybe leave a comment if you want, whatever. Anyway, this is the Hermit signing out. I was just sloppy today. I played Luigi's Mansion all night last night for some reason, and I'm just not as quick as I usually am. I think it also because I'm not wearing the hat.
This is always all rap. We should be alone. Magic glitter flaps.